Thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you to Steve and Mickey for an amazing event. Let's just put our hands together for that. This is actually our first event in several years, I think, obviously before COVID. These guys, they're amazing. You're going to love their stories. We encourage you to ask them questions. My name is Emily, and I'm with Blue Sky Ranger / Intellivision. Last month was the 40th anniversary of this group getting laid off from Mattel Electronics. Woo! Throughout the panel, you'll hear more about that whole story. But these guys have been getting together literally for 40 years, and that's all thanks to Keith Robinson, memorialized in that cartoon. You'll hear a little more about him as well. And we just want to thank you guys, the fans, the players of Intellivision that have been keeping it alive for this long. And we're just excited to have these guys back together for this panel this morning. And I'm going to let Tom, our moderator, introduce himself and take it away.
And thanks so much, Emily, for making this possible, because this really is, Emily is the organizer extraordinaire for making this happen. So thank you so much. Yay! Because I know how much work that is. So my name is Tom Boellstorff. I'm a professor at UC Irvine with my colleague Braxton Soderman, also a professor at UC Irvine. We have been working for many years on our book, which now is coming out from MIT Press. We have a postcard you can get, Intellivision, how a video game system almost battled Atari and almost bankrupted Barbie. Coming out this fall from MIT Press. And we're so lucky we got to interview all of these folks and many other folks here in the room for the incredible labor of love that it was to do that book. And every time we get to hear more of these stories, this history is so incredibly important in the world of technology, where everyone's talking about what's the new Vision Pro, what's the new this or that. The role of history is so incredibly important. And so it's always such an honor to be able to hear and learn from these folks. So so we have an hour today, right, as I understand, for our thing. And we are so lucky that we have 6 folks here, plus a couple amazing folks in the audience that you never know might be able to nudge them into saying a little. We'll see, no pressure. But 6 amazing people and 1 hour. So I am in the unenviable position of keeping time, and I beg forgiveness for that as well. Think of it like, when you only had, 4K in the cartridge, you had to cut decals, you had a deadline coming up. So what I'm going to do is I will set visibly for us to all see here a 2-minute timer, and I'll just start to make motions after 2 minutes. And we have several questions, but regardless of how many questions there are or where things are at 45 minutes, I will stop so that there's 15 minutes to get questions from the audience. Does that sound like a plan? So if you use less than 2 minutes or keep it shorter, then there'll be even more time to ask more questions and stuff. But we're so honored to have 6 amazing people here. So the first question that we will do just to get the ball rolling is to briefly introduce yourself. How did you get hired at Mattel? What have you been doing prior to that? Anything around those kinds of topics, just so that people can get to know you a little bit better. And we can go in whatever order you want. And so with that, I will get a timer started. So who would like to start? Go for it, Steve.
My name is Steve Roney. Before I went to Mattel, I worked at Hughes Aircraft Company for 6 years, and I drove by the Mattel office was actually right down the street from just the other side of the freeway from where my office was, and I drove by it sometimes at lunch, and I saw that they were hiring, and so I think I sent in a resume and called through to the human resource persons, and I took my resume and I crossed out my top secret clearance and said that I had 100 board games, and sent it in, and I know it took me a while to talk my way through HR because they were worried that I had made too much money or that I hadn't really worked on the right kind of hardware, but then I went in for the interview, and it turned out that they gave me a little assembly language test, and it turned out the assembly language is really just like the PDP-11 that I had done some work on just previously, And so I was able to ace that, and they weren't sure they could get me a second interview because of my salary, but and they didn't. They just hired me without the second interview. So, so.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Newstadt. Back in 1982, I was hired by Mattel Electronics. I had been getting a computer science degree in Pittsburgh, and this was my first job out of college. So I think I flew to New York, talked to Gabriel Baum, who was the VP there, putting the group together, and I took this assembly language test called the Minkoff measure. You can probably read about it in the book. and I passed, and they gave me an offer, so I decided I could write video games instead of going to a real company, and decided to go out there, but it was all because of Mark. He'll talk next, but we went to the same high school, and he got a job before I did and suggested that I go with him out to LA. But I remember I was making $12 an hour, my first paychecks, and so they hired people out of school, people from defense industry, because no one had done video games before. So Gabriel put together a very diverse crew. That was my story.
Hi, I'm Mark Kennedy. As Bob said, we got hired right out of college. I had sent letters to Mattel, Atari, and Magnavox, just on a wing, and Mattel contacted me first. Same thing, flew me to New York to take the Minkoff measure. Gabriel was very funny. He said, "There's no time pressure. No time pressure. Are you finished? No, there's no time pressure. Are you done yet?" But despite that, they made the offer. I accepted it. It was nice. I had my job lined up before my final term in college, and I had recommended Bob, and then they gave him a plant trip. So I said, they said, "You can go along too." So I got a free trip to California to come out and check. Once there, I wrote Scooby-Doo's Maze Chase, which was originally entitled Three Blonde Mice, but then it got Hanna-Barbera-ized. Then I did the award-winning Kool-Aid Man game, the dumbest game of 1983. I then went to Atari with Russ Haft and the group that moved over there, and there I did Centipede, and had almost finished Dig Dug when they shut that down, and I still had one of the ROMs. I gave it to Keith, and he ended up publishing it later under INTV. So got 4 games out.
All right, my name is Bill Fisher. I also got to Mattel right out of college. I applied to Hughes, TRW, and Mattel, and I got offers from, I believe it was Hughes and Mattel. And I said, all my friends said, well, you should go into aerospace. Aerospace is the future. And I said, well, but I want to do video games. And besides, I can always go get a real job. I wrote Space Hawk, Space Spartans with Steve here, and B-17 Bomber with Steve and John Soule, which was a fantastic experience. They were really great guys. We had a AAA team trying to get those games done on time, because we were all basically taking things that weren't quite finished and finishing them off and getting them out to the market as fast as we could. And very pleased with that. And then I went on to actually fly to Taiwan and hire the team that did Apple II and IBM PC stuff in Taiwan. So it was a pretty exciting time for 2.5 years. And then I started my own company, and I've been doing that for the last 40 years, doing games, education, military training, and some fun stories about that as well. But I'll pass that on now. Oh, okay.
I have my own mic. My name is Mark Urbaniec. The game I did was Vectron. I ended up becoming one of the group leaders, so that took me out of the programming pool. I came from TRW. I was working on a Z80 processor, and it had some lovely graphics you could do, so I did a Star Trek game on my lunch hour, only on my lunch hour. And that actually got me into the interview. They advertised in the newspaper, and that's how I found out about it. And I applied there, and there's no way I'm going to get this job. It's for people who are fun. I was also going to law school, and I took the Minkoff measure. Don Daglow ended up being my manager. He administered it. Second interview, Gabriel said, why would you want this job? He just did not think that a guy going to law school would find the gaming industry interesting, and I could tell the interview was going south fast. So I just said, I don't know, I guess I'm just a dumb guy. It seems like this would be a lot of fun. And then all of a sudden he smiled, and then I got hired. So who knows? Anyway, when I joined, it was very early on at Mattel, and so we weren't in our own building by then. And we were back in the back of a warehouse where you literally walked down a long aisle to the very back of it where people were playing with all the toys in the hallway. And that was just the most amazing thing ever. And anyway, then we ended up with our own building and started growing from there. And it was great until it wasn't.
We called that part of the building the submarine because it was all the exposed wiring and piping in the top.
I am David Warhol. My first game for the Intellivision was Mind Strike, which was released on the ECS, though it didn't have to be. I also contributed to Thunder Castle with Connie Goldman. And then after Mattel went out of business, I worked for INTV Corporation, publishing another 20, 25 games that were like the Super Pro line, all of that stuff. And my first connection with, and Mark was my boss, and Bob is my cubicle mate. My first connection with Mattel came on a family vacation to California. I was driving through California and looking out the back of a station wagon on the 405 freeway, and I saw the Mattel sign, and it was like, I was in fourth grade. People get paid to make toys? What a great idea. And then many years later, after I graduated from college, I was working for my college, and another famous Blue Sky Ranger, Don Daglow, who was managing the part of the department with Mike Minkoff, sent a request to the college to get graduates to apply. And it came across my desk, and I went, post this for graduates? No, I'm going to apply. So I was able, and we did post it, and Eddie Dombrower came from that crew as well. Anyway, I thanks to Don reaching out to the college, I applied, and I do remember Gabriel Baum asking me in my third interview. Well, I knew it was kind of going well because for 5 minutes we talked about my qualifications. For 10 minutes we talked about what it was like to work at Mattel. And then for 20 minutes we talked about the history of the symphony in Scandinavia or something like that. Because he was really looking for people with diverse backgrounds and different ways to bring creativity into technology. So hats off to him for bringing together an incredible crew.
And just like three kind of synthetic points that you hear from these amazing stories, programmers started young back then. It wasn't just a new thing now. They were all coming out of college. There were a couple of cases of people barely out of high school, like DeSisto. Also, people talk about Silicon Valley all the time, but this is a story of Southern California, right? And the influence of the military and aerospace, how many folks had connections to Raytheon or TRW. That's a really interesting piece of the story, but also the entertainment industry. And then also the impact of toys and Mattel and being at Mattel. So when all these folks had mentioned Gabriel Baum was in Europe at the time and was brought over to Mattel to create a group called Application Software, which was going to start making the Intellivision games in-house. They had all been made before then at APH, which was a startup in Pasadena that they continued to work with. And Gabriel really emphasized that idea of creativity, but Gabriel wasn't only bringing in his interest in creativity. Application Software was also based on this thing called preliminary design, which was a research group inside of Mattel that for decades was a kind of blue sky. They would use that term for creating toys. And many famous people, like there's this guy, Dave James, I don't know where he is, somewhere in this room, who among other things created the Running Man, who started off in preliminary design. And Gabriel Baum had amazing ideas for video game design, but he was also building off what was happening at Mattel beforehand. This is a very different story than Atari. This is a very different story than Coleco. This is a very different story than Commodore. So it's a really interesting aspect of video game history, these connections to toys, to Southern California, that is really valuable, and I think we can learn a lot from. So next question, I have two other questions, and we'll see if we can get through them, and then we can open it up. So, if you look, we just had some folks Mark and I think it was Bill signing Space Hawk and Vectron, signing on some of their games. And people talk about back in the day, it wasn't this AAA movie model with all the stuff nowadays. You sometimes would have one person design the game, write the manual, do the sound, do all that kind of stuff. And if you look on websites nowadays, you see often, John Soule did Astro Smash, or so-and-so did so-and-so. But actually, we know from our research and from listening to these stories, even in those very early days, there was collaboration. People were pioneering ways of working together to design video games. It sort of started with these folks in their cubicles. And so my second question is, do you have any kind of memory or story or example of, we've heard a couple already, but to say a little more about when you actually collaborated with someone on a game, whether it was more formally or just shouting over the cubicle wall. What was that like when that was unprecedented? No one had really been doing that before, and here you all are in your thing of all the tubes and wires. What's an interesting example maybe of how you all collaborated?
Well, beyond the places that Bill mentioned, where we did Space Spartans together and B-17 Bomber together, which were both already started before we got on them. One thing I remember, we also would get together for, sometimes games would have it'd be almost like a review of people would play other people's games, and we would sometimes have little meetings that would talk about a particular game, things that could be done, and the one that comes to my mind particularly was Thin Ice. We did lots of suggestions because it was running out of space too, and there's a place where in Thin Ice you're a penguin and you're skating around and you're drawing boxes, and it turns it to water, and there's a question about what the penguin should look like when it was in the water, and the people said, well, we don't have room for more pictures, more animations. And I said, well, there's a bit on the moving object that says whether it should use 16 pixels or 8 pixels high. And I said, well, when it goes in the water, just turn the bit off, and so that it's 8 pixels high. And so that means they didn't need any new artwork for it. That was one of the kinds of things that might collaborate on.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think all the games were collaborative. Basically, the year I was hired, the applications team went from 10 to 100 people, so it squared. It was exponential growth. And then you put them all in a warehouse that had no windows for security. It was actually just a cheap building, and it had skylights. So we were all in a bunch of cubes, like you might see at the end of the Tron movie or something like that. And so we were right next to each other, and Dave and I were in the same cube. So there was a lot of collaboration. I worked on a pinball game, and that pinball game was announced in a catalog before I was hired, and Mattel said, we're going to have a pinball game for the Intellivision. And so then they had to put it out or be sued for false advertising. So that game had the green light, and I got involved in it and did the physics, and we reworked the whole thing. But it had 3 screens and a demo mode and a bunch of innovations. And I worked on it with Min Chao Tran, another programmer, and there were separate people brought in for sound and graphics. So I think they were all collaborative.
Yeah, part of it was recognizing what your limitations were. I can program, I don't do graphics, I don't do sound. So when I was doing 3 Blonde Mice, it was a cat chasing around 3 mice being chased by a dog. So I had a C chasing M's being chased by a D. That's just my placeholder graphics. And then Connie Goldman came in and did just spectacular graphics. Then the game got, I said, Hanna-Barberaized. So they went, no, it's not going to be Scooby-Doo chasing ghosts and being chased by a skull. And so Connie had to go completely redo all the graphics for that. And then they decided it was going to work on the keyboard components. We had more sound capabilities. So Dave was brought in to do the sound. There's actually a lot of classical music in Scooby-Doo. And he did great sound because we had 2 sound chips. We could do this echo effect. So we had this really good organ sound effect, all done by him. He later helped do the sounds on Kool-Aid Man game, including the blood-curdling scream that the children were immobilized with. And funny note about that, the game was finalized on my last day at Mattel. And General Foods came and they saw it after I had left, and they said, "Oh, what about that scream?" I said, "Well, no, the developers left. You know, it'd be too hard to change that." So it went out that way. So sometimes we get to sneak stuff in.
Well, I'll tell two quick ones. One of the things that was very important there was that we were always competing to see how much stuff you could cram into how few bytes of the cartridges, because the cartridges were really tiny. And we would have contests for how can I do this algorithm in fewer, it's actually decals, not bytes, because it's 10 bits wide. But anyway, how can you squeeze it into fewer decals? And Steve was a champion of that, of figuring out bizarre ways to use things like explode status word as a function for doing a case statement with multiple branches and stuff like that. And that was a very important part of it because it was actually very hard. I mean, we were down to the wire on B-17 Bomber. We were down to the wire and had to find extra space and had to do weird things to deal with that. And so we were always really fighting the space, and anything you could do to cut even a single instruction out of an algorithm made a difference, because one single instruction, you know, was one out of 4,000 or one out of more like 2,000 that would fit in the cartridge. The other fun collaboration story I'll tell you is that Steve and John Soule and I, we had a great relationship on B-17 Bomber because we were each doing pieces of it. And I don't know, it just worked very naturally and informally. We would talk every day. John was a night owl. He would only show up at like, 4 o'clock in the afternoon or something? Yeah, something like that. And so we would talk during the day. We would work on stuff during the day, and then he shows up in the middle of the afternoon, and we would say, okay, this is what we did, here's the code, and he would work all night long, and then we would come in the morning, and there would be notes from him as to what he did and what we needed to do next. And so that was very collaborative and very informal. It was very fluid, but it totally worked. I mean, it got the thing done, and that was what was fun about it.
So my experience was a little different because I became a group leader. It actually became my job for part of the time to try to encourage collaboration or force it in some cases. Because there were some people who thought they could do graphics, and we had to tell them, Connie's going to help you on this, or their sound effects, etc., would be like, Dave, have you got a minute? And he used to be really nice and polite about me letting him come into his cubicle. When I could tell behind his eyes, he was like, would you leave me alone so I could just finish what I'm doing? So that's what I recall about that. But on the stuff I worked on, Gabriel Baum had looked at me and said he wanted something completely abstract and unrelatable to anything. So that's what Vectron became. And in terms of getting collaboration, everybody was suddenly busy. And nobody had any real good ideas, and it was like, I got to get back and work on this. So I was blessed because I got the go-ahead to get to a 16K game. And so I didn't have to work so hard at jamming everything into a small space. My best recollection, though, of collaboration was Russ Haft, of all things. I would not call myself a great programmer. I thought I was a good programmer, but not great. And I remember Russ helping some people try to jam stuff down into a smaller piece, and I remember getting up and running into his cubicle and picking up a computing algorithms book by Knuth. And he said, you'll just program better if you have a copy of this on your desk. And I don't know if it helped or not, but anyway, that's what I remember the most about collaborating.
I want to say that it's probably around 1981 or 1982 when the teams formed rather than individuals. I think a lot of the original games were done by solo artists, and when I joined, it just started to, people would drift into their natural gifts and talents, and you've heard Connie Goldman's name come up. There was a marketing designation that would say, now with super graphics. And all that meant was that Connie did the graphics. Yeah. But Connie was hired as a programmer, but because her art skills were so, absolutely great, that she then did a lot of the graphics for a lot of the games. And yeah, I was doing sound effects for wherever I could. Another guy, Bill Goodrich, and music and sound effects for Bill Goodrich. But Bill Goodrich being another of the audio contributors. And Ray Kessner, who's not here, he lives up in the Bay Area. who did Burger Time, and also He-Man with Rick Koenig, another brilliant programmer. I don't know how Ray got anything done, because as soon as I would have a problem every other day, I'd walk over to Ray's office and say, "Hey, Ray, you got a minute?" And you would walk me through, "Oh, that's how this works, or that's what that does." There were a couple people who got tapped a lot for those kinds of coaching and things like that. But yeah, and I think it was Tom who pointed out that this is when teams formed, in collaborative efforts. And yeah, I got to agree that it was fun to be part of that.
Awesome. And two really interesting take-home points from this about like collaboration is through that collaboration, you see the emergence of training, of how you educate someone. Like now at Irvine, we have a game studies major. There was not a game studies major back then, right? So like how do people learn? And even programs like this one called Killer Tomatoes that were developed, but those practices, but also the emergence of specialization, like Connie being brought up. Dave is, legendary as a sound music, pioneer. And so you see the emergence of collaboration and but specialization emerging as well. So those are two really interesting things that we're starting to take form as the industry was starting to take form. So my third question will be awesome because you already have started to answer it, and this will be really fun. So Intellivision game programming, like all programming back then, was shaped by a lot of constraints. And the main ones often people think about is cartridge space. 4K, not M, not G, not P, whatever comes after petabyte, I don't know what the hell it is. Forgive my language, but we're talking K here, right? 4K cartridges, 8 moving objects tops. Those were important constraints. But from us doing the research for the book, one thing that was really interesting too is constraints of time were really important. You didn't just download stuff off Steam back then. If you missed Christmas, whoo, that was not a good idea, right? 80% around of sales would happen right at Christmas time. Or constraints around marketing and licensing. And that could be around cartoon images or whatever. The Hanna-Barbera-ized, I wish we had that verb for the book, we'll use that in a future one, is one example of a constraint. But another example is when they created extra hardware like IntelliVoice for sound, or the ECS system, which had a computer keyboard that would go with the Intellivision. They needed marketing, needed games to go with that, right? So that could act as a form of constraint. And thanks to the generosity of all of these folks, they shared thousands of pages of documents with Braxton and I, including original computer code, all this amazing stuff. And so something from all of that code that is actually in our book that's coming out in a few months, Dave mentioned that he did this amazing game, Mind Strike, for Intellivision. But when they developed this computer system, was told, okay, this has to work for that. So buried in the comments to Mind Strike, I shall quote now, is some code that the average player would never know, right? You'd have to open it up. Now wait a second. I am a keyboard game. That means I must have a keyboard. I don't care what my programmer says, that I might work just fine on plain Intellivision. I decided I only want to run on an ECS. So there. So that gives you an example. So for my third and final question, can you share an example of how you overcame a constraint? And it could be cartridge size, moving objects, marketing, time, deadline, Hanna-Barbera, whatever. But in particular, can you, if anything pops into your head, one thing we really learned from doing the book is sometimes those constraints would be unexpected opportunities. In the INTV era, Connie Goldman once said, I want my pixels back. Because they had all this stuff, but there was something almost liberating about constraints, that it could make you think differently about what the whole point of doing a game was. So if you had any thoughts about that as well, it'd be really fun to hear. So just any story or example, you already have started on this, about how constraint shaped what you did, but maybe had some unexpected fun or creative consequences. And you don't have to go in order, whoever wants to.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and the very next line of code was it checking to see if the keyboard component was connected, and it didn't have to be. I would say that my main constraint was always the cartridge size. 4K is not a lot, but this is where I think some of the artistry or creativity came in, because it wasn't just how to play the game, but how to engineer it in as small as possible. And there was a formula I came up, I don't know if it's in your book or not.
Oh, yeah, yep.
But the idea was take the number of hours that you expect somebody to play a game, and then take the size of the game. And now, if you want to play a game for 40 hours, that's probably what we would want for somebody to play one of our games. If you take the amount of time and divide it by the size of the cartridge, you get this ratio. And now the games became 64K, then they became a megabyte, and then they became, on a DVD or a CD, and now games are 50, 60 gigabytes, whatever. World of Warcraft is enormous. And that ratio represents how much gameplay is required for each byte of code. Mm-hmm. And right now, it's like, if you look at the Intellivision, each byte of code represents about 4 or 5 seconds of gameplay, whereas in a more recent release, each byte only represents a millisecond or something like that. So you got to appreciate the work within the constraints. That was always mine, but I was really lucky to have been able to contribute in that way.
What I remember was, before I became a group leader, early on, we had the executive that was what ran most of the games. And figuring out how to steal and interrupt and bypass the executive was a lot of fun and really frustrating at the same time, because we didn't have any quality debugging tools or anything. I mean, if you grabbed that interrupt and held on to it too long, the screen everything just went off to the side and disappeared, and then you had to go back and go, what did I do that took too long? And try to cut that back and try to put it back together again. And Vectron, as I said, being completely abstract, there was no way it was going to work with 8 sprites. So it absolutely had to be something that I was building on the fly. And that whole concept of stealing an interrupt involved a lot of walking up and down cubicle aisles. And I know Keith was doing the same thing, and he and I were both, how did you do this? And how would you do that? And how would you check this? And throwing in our own debugging tools to try to figure out where exactly did I go wrong? And why didn't the routine return where it was supposed to? And that's the stuff that I remembered the most about trying to become innovative and to do something like that. But anyway.
So the thing I want to talk about is Space Spartans, because one of the tough things about that, we only had an 8K cartridge, and 3K of it was voice. So it was really 5K was the game. And we had a whole extra K to do a space combat game with a grid mode also. And one of the things that I felt very strongly about was having the combat be interesting. And we'd played Star Raiders and games like that, and the problem is that the opponents in that were fairly dumb. They would just come at you and go away and back and forth, and they were kind of random. And I wanted them to have actual activities that they did. And so what I did is I created this idea of a little script that the ship would come in, and then it would come at you, or it would come like this at you, or it would come like that at you. And there were about 4 or 5 of them. And then I realized, wait a minute, I can take not only that, but I can make it come in from the right and do this, but I could also make it come in from the left, from the other side, and do that. And I could make ones come in from the top and the bottom, and then I could make them do a spiral like this, but I could also make it spiral like that, and then I could flip that one that way and that way. And so there was actually only 5 major things that they did, but I could have them mirrored in different ways. And then beyond that, I said, well, wait a minute, I could have them do attack patterns. So if there's more than 3 enemies in the room, in the area that are fighting you, one would do this, one would do that, and the other one would come straight at you, or something like that. And all this was built with a series of nested little tiny tables that were like a couple of bytes long each. And they would go through this piece of code that would go XOR this, and then test this, and then do this, and then randomize this, and then randomize this, and go. And then the things would play out, and they would play out their sequences. And I was very pleased with that, but it took a lot of doing and some really gnarly code where the code is about this long and the comments are about that long to explain it, because otherwise it was completely unintelligible nonsense.
Just, I'm gonna jump in here, because this is probably more about collaboration than it is about constraints. On Space Spartan, so he did that, and I was doing like the battle computer and the tracking computer that's supposed to help you shoot the ships down. And so I didn't even look at what his code was because that would be cheating. And plus then I would have to figure it out. So it was a lot easier to just do it, to track them around, and that was what, so that was another way that the collaboration helped to make the tracking computer, I think, a little more natural, and it didn't really care what his maneuvers were, because I didn't know any of them what they were. I will now yield back to Mark while I think I'll save my minute for later.
Okay.
Yeah, for mine, I want to talk a little about when I moved to Atari. We were handed the hardware manual for the processor and the graphics chip, and a development machine to work on. We couldn't use the exec. Atari had someone working on reverse engineering the exec, and he actually had worked on the real Centipede game, so he was my contact, but I wasn't allowed to talk to him. We had to talk through an intermediary because couldn't share any information. No, it just had to be a third party. Okay. But we decided early on, you'd mentioned stealing interrupts. That had started becoming very common at Mattel. We were kind of moving beyond the exec. So we decided we would just kind of start from scratch. And we wrote the MCP, the Master Control Program. Thanks to Russ, he worked on the Tron. And we took all the lessons we had learned from the exec and the limitations and were able to expand on them. So we worked on a 2 interrupt cycle as opposed to a 3, so the games moved a little faster. For the sound chip, we made it so that you could have sounds playing on each individual channel, so it could have 3 sounds playing at the same time, which worked out really well in the Centipede. And that, I started in May. We had to have cartridges at CES in July. And all we had was title screens. But that whole period of time for me, that was a long time ago, and I've done a lot of things since then. But that 3 months was the most fun I've ever had programming, because it was just such a challenge, blank slate, but get it done. So that was fun.
Yeah, about constraints. So there were a lot of them on this pinball game. To make it work smoothly, there was physics and collision detection. And the machine didn't have a multiply instruction. So that multiply was pretty important. So it only could add, subtract, things like that. And a few other things. But so I had to write a multiply routine. And some other basic math, and it was compiled into tables. Anyway, there were a bunch of tricks to make the motion smooth, and then we wanted 3 screens, so the background information and the graphics had to be compressed because the cartridge was only so big, so that was compressed into this quad tree structure. And that was 1982. I think the book on quad trees came out in 1983. So, so luckily I'd learned a little about it in college. Anyway, there were a lot of constraints, and we just worked through them. Besides the cartridge, and pinball shipped on a 12K cartridge, so we didn't have to spend time cutting down to 8K. So that got out a little faster, but there were only maybe 256 bytes of RAM, and that was your whole stack, every variable. So most of the variety of the game came into the cartridge. And we actually listened to the reviews back then in magazines and they would say the games were too slow, or the games, didn't have enough content, and we did a lot of things to try to make them faster, like bypass the exec, basically write our own low-level routines and steal the interrupt you've heard. So these were kind of techniques to make the game faster, and maybe put in some randomness to make the game longer, or some of the things that Bill said. But so we listened and tried to make the games last longer and be more fun.
So it's, I don't really have a good, my main constraint I dealt with, I think, was space usually, because I worked on, after I worked on B-17, Space Spartans and B-17 Bomber, and I was working on I tried some game, they gave me some vague idea of something that was just an unfinished game that never got done. And then I did Utopia for the Aquarius and Masters of the, I was working on He-Man for ColecoVision, so I didn't do more Mattel stuff. But one of the other constraints was, so after we finished Space Spartans, and so it was released, so I was supposed to then, they wanted me, since I had done the voice stuff, to take the game, leaving the game alone, but change the sounds so that the voices would be in German or French or Italian. And the syntax for the numbers in German and French and Italian are not the same as they are in English. And trying to make that, and I still had to fit, and the game didn't really have any space to spare. Although the voice, I'm not sure, of course it was different voice too, so I'm not sure that the voice was, I don't remember what the size constraints were, but that was a little more challenging thing another thing that was not released, and we don't even really have a working ROMs for it. But anyway, I went past.
That's fine, thank you. Oh, you can hold that.
That's mine, right.
And two quick clarification points from those amazing things. The exec was about 2K of code that was on the master component itself, that the Atari didn't have anything like this. It was originally done to save space, and it automated certain processes. It slowed things down because it checked it 3 times a second, but it was this amazing kind of framework that Intellivision had for doing video games that other systems didn't, but as time passed, these folks found ways to bypass the exec, especially when the cartridges got faster, to be able to do things. Yeah, sorry, I meant cartridges got bigger, to be able to do that. The other quick thing about Steve Roney's thing, right, that he mentioned here about the German and French language versions of the IntelliVoice games that were never released. But nowadays we talk a lot about video game localization for different countries and languages around the world. This is arguably one of the first, possibly the first, very early example of localization, because when you didn't have voice, you would just translate the manual or the cover, right? So like for like French Canadian, the cover. But this was a very early case of actually redoing the games for different markets around the world. So it's very interesting historically that way. So this has been great. We've had all these great discussions and questions, and we actually have 15 minutes left. So I know. So thank you so much for that. So thank you, timer, and thank you for you all finding these great stories. But so I really wanted to give, we wanted to give folks in the audience, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, and please when you ask the question, just let us know if it's for one person or a group. I will keep doing the timer just so we can get in as many questions as possible. So thank you. And do we, you have a big voice, right? Or do you want to do we have a roving mic here?
Yeah, it doesn't roll very much.
Yeah, I don't want to cause a, it's being recorded, so we probably do want it to be mic'd.
Nowadays, when you develop a video game, you have something like Unity or Unreal, et cetera. You have this super easy and diverse development environment. You have texture programs, you have modeling programs. What did a development environment for an Intellivision game look like? What did you write your code in, and what did you design your graphics in? For anyone.
Great question.
Well, it was written, the code was written in a 1610 machine language. We had workstations where we could compile and link and then download into an Intellivision that had been modified to play the game. There were a couple of attempts at making graphics programs. Mr. Culler was one of them. He wrote an Intellivision game that allowed you to modify graphics, and that's what opened up Connie's world to be able to interactively, right there in front of the screen, do that. Other than that, earlier, before, you'd have to draw things on graph paper and count the bits and then just type in the numbers that represented 100110. Very painstaking, but yeah, we developed tools that allowed us to be more productive.
Yeah, doing Vectron in an environment where there was no debugging stuff, I mean, I called them nasties, but the little nasties that would run around eating up the matrix around you, I thought I was awfully clever, and then I suddenly ended up having the nasty go off and start eating up memory, and the whole thing just crapped out, and I literally had to solve the problem with a VCR, just recording the game until I could finally figure out that, okay, that guy went off and everything went away. That guy must have gotten into memory and then figured out a better way to constrain stuff. So there were, in my world at the time, there was nothing. And as he was saying, you wrote the code, you compiled the code, you downloaded it back, you said play. So if you wanted to make one little change, you went through that whole 15-minute process or something like that.
Really quickly, I would debug by using the halt instruction, which would crash the program. And if I couldn't figure something out, I'd put in the code, if this equals this, then halt. And then I'd play the game, and if it crashed, I would say, oh, well, it took so long to try to debug that, it's a skill that helped me in the future, I spend more time trying to figure out, how is this, what's going on behind the scenes here, than the actual tools allowed.
Yeah, I was going to say that the way we developed games, we brought up an editor, edited code in an editor on a VT100 terminal connected to a PDP-11. So we would edit the source code, and we would run it through a macro assembler. So there was a macro phase, an assembler phase, got to machine code. That maybe if used a high-level language, that would be a compiler these days. Then we went through a linker, and then we downloaded it and tested it. So in a way, software development hasn't changed in 40 years.
We eventually repurposed the failed original keyboard component into a debugging station. So it had extra capabilities, and I think that was happening right around the time I left. But that opened up debugging. Before that, we only had the widget, which was a hardware debugging tool. And we had 2 of them or 1 of them?
We had at least 2 data widgets, yeah. That's what I
So we had to fight over those. Scooby-Doo was developed entirely on that because I didn't have my own development station. Not bitter. So yeah, it was very basic kinds of stuff. And QA, they would use VCRs. And they would play the game while recording it, and then they saw something, oh, look at this, he went out of bounds, because they'd come and say, oh, we got it to do this. And we're like, yeah, sure you did. If you can't show me, it didn't happen. So they fixed that.
Next question.
Well, I'll give a real quick one. The other thing that we did is because, eventually you had to test it on a ROM. So I did a lot of the ROM burning for the group, and it was really complicated, especially when you had like B17, because it had 12K, and each ROM is 4K, but it's 4K bytes. And that means that you had to have a low and a high one because it was 10 bits wide. The ROMs were 10 bits wide. So you had to burn 6 EEPROMs for the game B-17 Bomber and put those into a card and have them all proper and have them all labeled so you knew what the heck they were. And then they plugged that into the machine and then you play it, and most of the time it worked and sometimes it didn't, for various reasons we won't go into today. But that was a large part of the process. It was very hardware intensive and manual, and it took quite a bit of time to burn those ROMs sometimes.
Great question and great answers. So, another question? Yeah.
Do you have any examples of an Easter egg being built into a game that you worked on?
For the sake of the recording, the question is about Easter eggs.
Yeah,
Yeah, when I was at Atari, it was frowned upon at Mattel. But at Atari, I said, I'm going to put one in. And Russ Haft, my manager, said, as long as I can't find it, it's fine. Yeah. So if you could make the keypad read 0 and reset the game, instead of Atari Presents, it said MKK Programming Presents. And then I also left some bombs in the ROM. Just if anyone disassembled it, especially the first games we released for Mattel or for Atari, we figured Mattel was going to go and reverse engineer them and figure out what we were doing. So right after the beginning, there was a jump over the text, and it said, "Why are you disassembling this code? Don't you know that's not nice?" So we had our fun.
At the time, Keith and I were both programming still before we even made group managers. It wasn't just frowned upon. It was, Keith and I tried many times to go to Gabriel and say, can we get some recognition for the programmers? I mean, can we have something where it would say designed by or programmed by or something? And it was absolutely key, you know, that Gabriel would look at us and smile and say, I understand. Absolutely not. If it happens, you need to make sure that the programmers understand their job's on the line, et cetera. And so after about the second or third time Keith and I did it, we went back and Keith said, so we're going to do this, right? And, oh, no, we can't. And we both ended up putting our names in our games, his in Solar Sailor and mine in Vectron. And I was scared out of my mind that Gabriel was going to find out that he told us specifically, do not do this. And we went ahead and did it. And mine is so hard, I can't even do it anymore to get my name to pop up. But it was a fun time. I'm sure a lot of the programmers did the same thing, and some of them admitted it, and some of them have not admitted it to this day. So.
Oh yeah, well there were in all of the INTV games there were Easter eggs. It was almost required that we were putting them in. Steve Ettinger, the programmer of most of those. If you hold down the 3 and the 7 key when you hit reset on those games, you'd often get credit screens, things like that, or hold down the 0. I'm not sure what the cheat code was, but when you hit reset. Mind Strike, my first game, is a board game, and it came with 50 playfields. And board number 47, they're all symmetrical. Board number 47 reads Dave in the, if you look at it upside down, right side up. Another part about the constraints is that we only stored half the board because they were all symmetrical and just built them out of symmetry. But we released, was it Centipede? No, I think it was your Dig Dug game. Dig Dug got released, and it was a 12K game, but by then we were using 16K cartridges. And so I slipped in the whole game of Tron Deadly Discs, but we didn't have the license for it. So I got rid of the Tron graphics and put in the Burger Time dogs. So if you find the Intellivision Dig Dug and hold down the right key combination, you'll get the entire game of Deadly Dogs.
Well, I'm exceptionally jealous of you guys for having enough space in your ROMs to put your name in, let alone anything else, because I nearly lost my mind getting the last decal out of B-17 Bomber the day it shipped. So congratulations for having enough room left over, Mr. 16K.
If you learned how to burn EEPROMs faster, you would have been able to do that then.
One interesting point, and then, sorry? Okay, sure, okay. One quick point, and then we'll have some closing words, and we'll have a little time to schmooze. But just, it's so interesting just hearing these stories now about the Easter eggs is, during this period, the idea of a game studio, that word was not used. Like nowadays, video game programming is analogized game design to studios, like movie studios, right? You have cut scenes, you have all the credits at the end like a movie. But back in this day, these folks, when we would ask them, what were you called? What did you call yourselves? The number one thing they would say is, I was a programmer. Right? People, they thought of it as programming, where you're getting X dollars an hour to program, to code. And so that your name on the game, like that's a way for you to get poached by another company. Why on earth would we reveal who is doing this for us when it's not that model? And Intellivision actually had its own magazine called Intellivision Game Club News. And there were interviews of Mark and other people in there where they wouldn't even use your actual name, because they were so worried you were going to get poached.
I'm going to just jump in and say, at the time that when we had moved into the new building, we had all the cubicles lined up, and there was a headhunter. I can't remember her last name.
Shirley Dalrymple.
Shirley, yeah. And you could tell when Shirley was hunting, because if she got one extension and nobody was there to answer it, you could just hear the phones just go down. The next one would ring 3 times, and then the next one would ring 3 times, and someone would go, Shirley's calling. And if someone was interested, they had to find a way to sneak over and grab the phone. But
Go ahead.
Unfortunately, we have to clear out for the next group, but I wanted to thank you guys so much, and thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone will be back at our booth. We're on the far left wall. They'd love to continue answering your questions, signing autographs. I wanted to let you know that Blue Sky Rangers is online, mainly on eBay. We've got lots of good stuff on eBay, so check us out, Blue Sky Rangers. If you have any questions you'd like to email us, it's info@blueskyrangers.com. And then, Dave, I just wanted you to say a few words about Keith that you wanted to chime in. We keep mentioning this Keith person. Who is Keith?
Yeah, I did want to give a big shout out to Keith Robinson. He was one of the group leaders with Mark Urbaniec, And he really is the spirit that has kept this group together. He's the guy who kept organizing reunions on the anniversary, and then he eventually acquired the Intellivision rights and continued to promote it for 15, 20 years before his untimely death a few years ago. He's just a great, charismatic enthusiast, and honestly, I think that the reason that we are all so connected and promoting this is because of the love that he had for what it is we do. And so, yeah, everybody remember Keith. And I think there's an homage to him at the National Video Game Museum. Yeah.
I have a picture of it. I was just there.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a giant mural of him that's done in pixelated form out of Rubik's Cubes.
Oh, Texas.
Yeah. So, yeah, thanks, Keith, for keeping us all together. You're a great guy.